A faint stillness settles over Canadian streets long before anyone realizes it. Not the silence of emptiness, but the quiet presence of people who move through the world with a softer rhythm. For Americans, this contrast appears in small, almost invisible gestures, moments so subtle they slip past the untrained eye. Yet taken together, they form an atmosphere that feels unmistakably different. In Canada, daily life hums at a lower volume. Doors swing gently as strangers hold them open without pomp. Conversations drift in calm tones, measured and low, as if everyone agrees the air itself deserves respect. And perhaps the most striking detail is how naturally these patterns unfold, not as performance, but as cultural instinct. The first impressions are sensory. Crosswalks feel unhurried. Even during rush hour, people queue without tension, forming neat lines that seem to organize themselves. Street noise feels softened at the edges. Even the way Canadians acknowledge one another carries a kind of restrained warmth. Brief nods, polite smiles, small courtesies exchanged like passing lanterns. Americans often notice the unusual quiet of public spaces. Trains where passengers speak just above a whisper. Cafes where background music never competes with conversation. Sidewalks where collisions of pace are rare. This calm doesn't read as shyness. It feels more like collective consideration, a gentle agreement to share space without friction. Beneath these impressions lie deeper cultural differences, shaped by values that privilege harmony over assertion. Canadian communication leans toward the indirect, the diplomatic, the careful. People soften opinions with qualifiers, leave room for others to enter the conversation, and navigate disagreements with understated tact. The emotional climate favors steadiness. Outbursts, even passionate ones, stand out sharply against the social terrain. And in this restraint, Americans often sense an unfamiliar quiet confidence, a strength that doesn't announce itself. The pace of life echoes this subtlety. Efficiency matters, but rarely at the expense of civility. Even in large cities, the rhythm feels moderated, as if the culture collectively resists unnecessary rush. These differences surface most vividly in everyday interactions. A bus full of passengers murmurs a chorus of thanks to the driver as they step off. Neighbors shovel each other's sidewalks without knocking on doors or expecting acknowledgement. Office workers refill communal coffee pots without comment, driven less by obligation than by an ingrained understanding of shared responsibility. In grocery stores, shoppers place items on conveyor belts with surprising order, leaving clear space for the next person. When two people approach a doorway simultaneously, they pause, sometimes both at once, each insisting the other go first, resulting in quiet, polite stalemates. Even apologies operate as cultural shorthand, exchanged not as admissions of fault, but as subtle gestures of connection. For many Americans, these quiet behaviors slowly reshape the emotional landscape of daily life. Social tension softens. Interactions feel less transactional. The absence of constant competition creates room for awareness of others, of the environment, of one's own pace. And over time, the stillness that once felt foreign begins to feel grounding. Canadians seldom draw attention to these habits, yet they shape street corners, workplaces, neighborhoods, and casual encounters with remarkable consistency. This collective restraint becomes a kind of invisible architecture, guiding the atmosphere without ever demanding notice. In time, the quiet qualities that initially puzzled Americans begin revealing their cultural roots. Much of Canadian restraint comes from a deep social value, placed on minimizing disruption, on ensuring that one person's presence doesn't overwhelm another's. This mindset appears everywhere, in the soft cadence of conversations, in the patient merging on highways, in the gentle pauses before speaking. Even laughter tends to arrive in measured waves, more warm than boisterous, and while this can feel subdued to Americans accustomed to expressive openness, it carries an emotional steadiness that gradually becomes unmistakable. The culture encourages self-regulation, not out of suppression, but out of respect and understanding that social spaces belong to everyone equally. As Americans spend more time in Canada, small generalizations begin to emerge from repeated observation. Groups waiting at a crosswalk rarely surge forward when the light changes. They start walking without the competitive urgency that often marks American intersections. In apartment buildings, residents speak in hallways with softened voices, instinctively aware of shared walls. Parks, even when full, retain a sense of ease. Dog owners exchanging polite nods, joggers passing with a quiet sorry, rather than a burst of dominance. At community events, crowds move fluidly, guided less by assertive direction and more by the subtle cues of those around them. These patterns appear so consistently that they stop feeling like exceptions and instead reveal themselves as the cultural norm. This steady gentleness also shapes how Canadians handle conflict. Rather than direct confrontation, disagreements unfold in cautious layers, with phrasing designed to preserve dignity on both sides. Feedback comes buffered with empathy. Frustration is often translated into softened language, and while Americans may initially interpret this as avoidance, it is actually a deeply rooted cultural strategy resolving tension without escalating it. Even public complaints, when they appear, feel restrained, their tone tempered by the expectation that dignity should remain intact for everyone involved. Slowly, these quiet habits reach deeper psychological spaces for Americans living in Canada. The emotional temperature of daily life cools in a comforting way. Moments that once demanded defensiveness ask instead for patience. Even personal identity begins to shift as the environment encourages calm over intensity and collaboration over individual assertion. Many Americans find themselves adopting these rhythms without conscious intention, waiting more, listening longer, lowering their voice in conversation, offering spontaneous help without turning it into performance. The quietness becomes internal as much as external. In neighborhoods, this transformation is even more visible. People clear snow from sidewalks without expecting recognition. Waste bins line the street with orderly precision. Community gardens grow not through loud initiatives, but through steady, anonymous care. And when storms strike or power flickers out, neighbors check on one another in understated ways. Simple knocks, brief questions, quiet reassurances. These gestures rarely become stories told aloud, but they define the character of the place. They reveal a country where support flows through small, consistent acts rather than grand declarations. The longer Americans immerse themselves in this environment, the more they understand that Canada's quietness is not emptiness. It is attentiveness, a cultural practice built on awareness of others. And in that realization, the country's gentlest qualities begin to reshape their sense of belonging. Over time, this quiet way of moving through the world begins to alter how many Americans interpret space, emotion, and connection. The cultural emphasis on gentleness creates a social climate where people feel less watched, less judged, less pressed to perform. The collective restraint opens room for subtlety, for pauses in conversation, for unspoken understanding. Even brief interactions, exchanging a thanks with a bus driver, stepping aside on a narrow sidewalk, acknowledging a stranger with a small nod, build into a rhythm that slowly recalibrates expectations of daily life. What once felt understated begins to feel reassuring, as though the culture itself is offering a soft buffer against the intensity of the outside world. This shift often brings an unexpected transformation. Many Americans start noticing their own reflexes changing. Voices soften without effort. Apologies slip out more easily, carrying not guilt but awareness. Impatience gives way to hesitation, then to consideration. And as these habits deepen, they influence the emotional environment around them. Workplaces feel calmer. Neighborhoods feel more cohesive. Even errands feel different when everyone shares the same instinct to reduce friction rather than push through it. The cumulative effect is a quiet form of community, built not through dramatic gestures, but through countless small decisions to be gentle. In this atmosphere, people develop a sharpened sensitivity to others, a kind of cultural listening. Moments of tension become opportunities to preserve harmony rather than win ground. Silence becomes a neutral space, not something to fill, and the feeling of being surrounded by people who consistently choose courtesy fosters a subtle sense of trust. It becomes clear why Canadians rarely need to announce their values. They live them in ways that ask for no acknowledgement. Eventually, many Americans reflect on how these quiet traits influence the broader worldview. A society that prioritizes modesty over spectacle, cooperation over competition, and restraint over dominance naturally produces a different emotional landscape. It teaches that strength can be calm, that kindness can be quiet, and that consideration can be powerful even when it draws no attention. The transformation is not immediate, but it is steady and internal rebalancing shaped by a culture that rarely raises its voice, and perhaps that is the lasting impression. Canada's quietness is not absence. It is presence expressed softly,